Sometimes life writes stories no one could ever plan. One small act, a simple exchange on an ordinary street, can twist into something bigger, heavier, and far more dangerous than anyone imagined. In a quiet American town, a billionaire's casual stop at a lemonade stand would set the stage for a chilling turn of events. By the next day, both their lives would hang on the edge, and only one would hold the power to save the other. But neither of them saw it coming. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today and what time you're currently watching this video. If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more. The late summer sun hung low over the quiet suburban street, casting long golden shadows across the cracked sidewalks. It was the kind of neighborhood where the breeze carried the faint smell of fresh-cut grass and distant barbecue smoke. But at the corner of Maple and Fifth, something else caught the attention of anyone passing by, a small wooden table with a crooked sign that read in bright, uneven letters, Lemonade 50. Behind the table stood a girl who couldn't have been more than 9. Her braids swung as she poured from a cloudy plastic pitcher into paper cups. She wore a faded pink t-shirt with a tiny lemon print and a pair of well-worn sneakers. Despite the sticky heat, she looked determined, eyes scanning the street for her next customer. That's when the black SUV rolled to a slow stop. The kind of SUV that looked expensive without trying, clean lines, tinted windows, tires so polished they seemed to shine even in the dusty light. For a moment, the little girl froze, unsure if the car was stopping for her or just making a turn. The back window lowered smoothly, revealing a man with silver hair, a crisp white shirt, and sunglasses that reflected the entire street back at her. He had the kind of calm presence that made you wonder if he was famous or dangerous or both. "How much for a cup?" His voice was deep, but not unkind. 50 cents, she said, straightening her back. The man smiled faintly and reached into his wallet. Instead of coins, he pulled out a crisp $100 bill. He held it out between 2 fingers, the way you'd offer something fragile. Her eyes widened. "Sir, I don't have change for that." "Keep it," he said, "but pour me the best lemonade you've got." Her hand shook slightly as she filled the cup, the ice clinking softly. She passed it to him carefully, half afraid she'd spill it on the car's spotless interior. He took a slow sip, then set the cup in the console. "It's good," he said simply, giving a small nod before the window slid back up. The SUV pulled away, the sound of its engine fading into the warm evening. The girl stood there for a moment, the bill still clutched in her hand. She didn't know who the man was, but something about him, the way he looked directly at her, the measured way he spoke, made her think she'd remember him for a long time. Across town, in the top-floor suite of the Whitmore building, the man sat behind a massive desk of polished walnut. Edward Whitmore wasn't just wealthy. He was one of the most recognizable figures in the city. Investments, real estate, philanthropy. His name appeared in newspapers more often than most politicians. But the lemonade stop had been unplanned. He'd been on his way back from a meeting when the sight of the hand-painted sign caught his attention. Something about it reminded him of summers when things were simpler, before deals and deadlines, before people treated him like his name was more important than the man himself. Still, he didn't dwell on it long. His phone buzzed, a message from his assistant reminding him of an early morning yacht meeting the next day. He leaned back in his chair, glancing briefly at the skyline before returning to his work. The next morning, the little girl, her name was Maya, told her mother about the man in the SUV. Her mother, busy loading laundry into a basket, only half listened at first. But when Maya held out the $100 bill, her mother stopped cold. "Where did you get this?" she asked sharply. "I told you. A man bought lemonade from me." Her mother examined the bill like it might disappear. She'd raised Maya to be careful, to keep her head down in a world that didn't always play fair. Something about the story didn't sit right. People didn't just hand strangers money like that. Not in their part of town. "You didn't tell him your name, did you?" her mother asked. "No." Her mother exhaled slowly. "All right, put it somewhere safe. And maybe take a break from the lemonade stand for a few days." Maya nodded reluctantly, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the man. She wondered what someone like him did all day. She wondered if he remembered her at all. That afternoon, Edward walked through the private dock, greeting 2 men in dark suits who stood by his yacht. The water shimmered under the bright sun, small waves slapping against the pier. It was supposed to be a routine meeting with investors, a short cruise to discuss a waterfront development project. But as he stepped onto the deck, he noticed the wind picking up, the water turning choppier than usual. One of the crew members mentioned a storm system forming miles offshore, but it wasn't expected to reach them. Edward didn't think much of it. He'd been on the water in worse conditions. By evening, however, the wind had grown stronger. Waves slapped harder against the hull, spraying salt water over the rails. The sky, once bright blue, had shifted into a bruised, unsettled gray. Still, the meeting continued, charts, contracts, handshakes. Back in her neighborhood, Maya lay awake in bed, listening to the wind whistle through the trees. It wasn't just the storm that kept her up. She couldn't shake the strange feeling she'd had since the man drove away, like a thread had been pulled, connecting their lives in some invisible way. She didn't know that miles away, Edward Whitmore stood on the deck of his yacht, gripping the rail as the first cold drops of rain began to fall, and the sea, dark and restless, was only just beginning to rise. The first roll of thunder was low, almost hesitant, like the sky was clearing its throat. Edward Whitmore glanced upward, then toward the horizon, where dark clouds had stacked themselves into a jagged wall. The water beneath the yacht shifted uneasily, small whitecaps forming and disappearing in seconds. "Looks like it's coming in faster than they predicted," one of the crew muttered, tightening a rope along the deck. Edward's two investors stood by the table inside the cabin, watching the weather through the wide glass windows. "Should we head back?" one asked, his voice carrying that mix of politeness and worry people used when speaking to a man with far more money than they had. Edward shook his head. "We'll finish the meeting and turn in before it gets bad. Storms blow over quick this time of year." The crew didn't argue, but they moved with sharper motions now, coiling lines and securing loose equipment. Back on shore, Maya sat cross-legged in the living room, sketching on a piece of scrap paper. The TV flickered in the background, the weatherman pointing at swirling patterns on a map. Storm front moving toward the bay. Possible high winds. Her mother clicked her tongue. Those people out on the water better have sense." She stood and shut the window against the sudden damp smell in the air. Maya's pencil slowed. She thought of the man in the SUV again, how he had said little, but his eyes had studied her for that short moment like he was taking in every detail. Something about him didn't feel like he belonged to the world she knew. She wondered if people like him ever got caught in storms. Out on the bay, the rain came quick, slanting sideways as the wind screamed across the open water. The yacht's polished wood deck turned slick in seconds. Edward stepped out to help one of the crew secure a flapping canvas cover, his shirt plastered to his skin. "Sir, you should get inside," the captain shouted over the roar. "I'm fine," Edward said, but his voice didn't sound as confident as it had an hour ago. The vessel rocked hard, sending one of the investors stumbling against the wall inside. A plate slid off the table and shattered. Lightning split the sky, so close it lit the water like glass, followed by a crack of thunder that made the windows tremble. "Turning back now," the captain bellowed from the wheel. The next jolt was sharper, a swell hitting the side of the yacht like a giant shove. Edward gripped the rail, his knuckles whitening. He had sailed enough to know this wasn't just an uncomfortable ride. The wind had shifted direction, pushing the boat toward the jagged rocks lining part of the shoreline. "Starboard," the captain yelled, spinning the wheel. The crew worked like machines, pulling ropes, adjusting sails, and shouting warnings over the wind. The investors stayed inside, pale-faced and silent. Another wave crashed over the bow, drenching Edward from head to toe. Salt water stung his eyes, but he refused to let go of the rail. In a corner of his mind, he wondered, not for the first time, if all the money in the world made a difference when the ocean decided to remind you who was in charge. Maya's neighborhood was a good 5 miles from the water, but even there, the wind rattled street signs and tossed leaves in swirling patterns down the road. She stood at her bedroom window, watching as the storm took full shape. Her mother called from the kitchen. "Stay away from the glass, Maya." "I'm not leaning on it," she replied, but she didn't move. Something about the wildness outside was hypnotic. A flash of light in the distance caught her eye. For a second, she thought it was more lightning, but this was lower, closer to the water's edge. Then it was gone. She pressed her forehead to the cool glass, straining to see. On the yacht, the situation had shifted from inconvenient to dangerous. The captain's jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the instruments. "We've got a problem. Engine's not responding right." Edward's pulse kicked harder. "How bad?" "Bad enough. Hold on to something." The wind slammed into them again, harder this time, tilting the deck. One of the investors cried out as a chair skidded across the cabin floor. A wave the size of a small truck rose ahead, black and curling at the top. The captain steered into it, the boat climbing for what felt like a full minute before crashing down the other side. Edward stumbled, hitting the railing hard. His fingers slipped for a split second before finding their grip again. Rain blurred everything, the deck, the sky, even his thoughts. By now, emergency weather alerts were scrolling across TV screens in the city. A few fishing boats had already made it to dock, but others were still out in the storm. Maya's mother shook her head at the news. "That's what happens when you think the water listens to you." Maya didn't answer. She was thinking about how, when the man in the SUV had driven away yesterday, she had felt a strange tug at her chest, like their paths weren't done crossing. She didn't know why the feeling was back now, stronger, as if something out there was shifting in a way she couldn't see. The captain barked another order, the crew rushing to respond. The rocks were too close now, the storm having pushed the miles off course. Edward moved to help with the lines again, but the deck pitched violently, and his grip slipped for real this time. He went down hard, his shoulder slamming the wet wood. Pain shot up his arm, white and sharp. For a moment, the sounds around him, shouting, the The slap of the sails, the crash of waves, felt distant, like he was underwater even though he wasn't. A crewman pulled him back to his feet, shoving him toward the cabin. "Stay inside," he shouted. Edward didn't argue this time. He staggered in, dripping and shivering, staring out through the rain-streaked glass as the dark outline of the rocks loomed closer. The storm wasn't done yet. The wind howled, the sea rose higher, and the yacht groaned against the force. Somewhere in the mess of rain and salt spray, Edward realized they might not make it back before something gave way. And on shore, in a small, warm house on Maple Street, Maya still stood at her window, eyes fixed on the restless horizon. She didn't know it yet, but tomorrow, the day after that brief meeting over a cup of lemonade, her life was about to collide with Edward Whitmore's in a way neither of them could have imagined. The sound inside the yacht was a mix of chaos, the groan of straining wood, the deep thud of waves slamming against the hull, and the sharp, quick voices of the crew trying to be heard over the storm. Edward braced himself against the cabin wall, water dripping from his hair into his eyes. The investors sat huddled on the opposite side, white-knuckled, looking anywhere but at the dark water outside. The captain's voice came over the radio from the wheelhouse. "We're losing power completely. I'm calling the Coast Guard." Edward felt the words in his stomach. Losing power meant the storm was in control now, not them. He stepped closer to the window, squinting through the rain-smeared glass. The rocks ahead looked sharper, closer, jagged teeth waiting just beneath the surface. On shore, the storm had turned the streets into rivers. Water ran along the gutters in rushing streams, carrying leaves, sticks, and the occasional can. Maya's mother had pulled the curtains shut, but Maya had cracked one open just enough to keep watch on the sky. The lightning flashed so brightly it lit the wet pavement outside like daylight for half a second. She counted under her breath 1, 2, 3, before the thunder rolled through the air like a drum. "Close," her mother's voice called from the kitchen. "Unplug the TV, please." Maya moved slowly, glancing once more at the dark, restless line of water in the distance before doing as she was told. She didn't know why her chest felt tight, but it wasn't just a storm. It was something else, a prickling sense that something important was happening out there, something she wasn't seeing. Back on the yacht, the captain's orders came faster now. "Drop anchor. We're drifting toward the rocks." 2 crew members ran to the bow, wrestling with the heavy chain. The yacht dipped and rose violently, each wave threatening to knock them off their feet. Edward moved instinctively to help, but the captain's voice cut through. "Stay inside." Another wave hit, bigger, meaner, sending seawater flooding across the deck. One of the crew slipped, his legs sliding dangerously close to the edge before another man grabbed his jacket and yanked him back. The anchor finally dropped, the chain rattling and groaning, but the current still dragged them. Edward gritted his teeth. The control he was used to in boardrooms meant nothing out here. The storm didn't care about money, deals, or his name. Miles away, the Coast Guard station received the distress call. 2 rescue boats were already out assisting a fishing vessel near the inlet, but another was dispatched toward Edward's location. The problem: the storm's wind was pushing hard against the direction they needed to go. Inside the cabin, one investor spoke for the first time in nearly an hour. "We're not going to hit the rocks, right?" His voice cracked on the last word. Edward didn't answer. He didn't trust his voice to sound steady. Instead, he focused on the deck outside, where water ran in sheets, making the wood gleam under the flashes of lightning. In her neighborhood, the storm's noise grew so loud that Maya could barely hear her mother's phone conversation with her aunt. The wind howled like a freight train moving through the street, bending the trees until their branches scraped the windows. Maya stood in the hallway now, arms wrapped around herself. She wanted to ask her mother about the man in the SUV, whether people like him ever got caught in dangerous situations, but it sounded silly in her head. Still, her mind kept returning to that moment yesterday. The rolled-down window, the $100 bill, the quiet way he'd said, "It's good." She had felt important for those few seconds, seen in a way she didn't expect. The captain's shout brought Edward's attention back to the present. Rope snapped. Anchor's useless. The crew scrambled to adjust, pulling at lines while the yacht swung broadside to the waves, the most dangerous position. The side of the vessel slammed into the water again, shuddering from the impact. Edward grabbed the edge of the table for balance, but the next lurch was worse. The yacht tilted so far that for a second, he thought it might roll completely. One of the investors shouted something panicked, but the words were lost in the storm's roar. The captain's voice was sharp now. "Brace for impact." Edward didn't see the rock, not clearly, just a shadow in the frothing water, before the yacht scraped over it with a deep, grinding sound that sent a shiver up his spine. Water began pooling in the lower deck. One crew member disappeared down the stairs, returning seconds later with his face set in a grim line. "We've got a breach. It's filling fast." The captain's jaw tightened. "Life vests. All of you. Now." Edward slipped his arms through the straps, tightening them with fingers that didn't feel like they were working right. The cold was sinking into him, bone deep now. The investors fumbled with theirs, hands trembling. They all knew the same thing. Once the water came in fast enough, the yacht wouldn't stay afloat. The rescue boat was still 15 minutes out, fighting every inch of the way against the waves. The radio crackled with updates, but the message was the same. Hold on as long as possible. Edward moved to the door, looking out at the violent water. He'd never been afraid of much in his life, but this was different. Nature wasn't something you negotiated with. Another massive wave lifted the yacht, slamming it back down with a force that made the hull groan like it was in pain. Something toppled inside the cabin, glass shattering against the floor. "Everybody to the deck," the captain yelled. They stumbled out into the rain, the wind stealing their breath. The crew had prepared the life raft, its orange sides bright against the dark water. But getting to it meant timing each move between the violent sway of the boat. Edward waited his turn, gripping the railing with both hands. The world felt like it had narrowed to the wet wood under his feet, the black water waiting below, and the thin, desperate hope that the rescue boat would appear before the sea decided otherwise. He had no idea that on shore, a young girl named Maya, the same one he had met for only minutes yesterday, would soon become part of this night in a way that would change both of their lives. The wind clawed at Edward's face as he stepped onto the slick deck. The rain came sideways now, each drop like a tiny needle against the skin. The captain was shouting over the storm, but the words broke apart in the wind, forcing everyone to watch his hand signals instead. He pointed toward the life raft, the only real chance they had left. The raft was tied down to the stern, its bright orange shell bobbing wildly with every roll of the yacht. 2 crew members were already there, wrestling to keep it steady while the others lined up to board. The investors stayed close to Edward, their eyes wide and fixed on the water, as if staring too long might drag them in. The yacht gave another sickening lurch, throwing Edward sideways into the railing. His shoulder hit the metal hard enough to make him wince, but he held on. The taste of salt was sharp in his mouth, half from the sea spray, half from biting his lip. "Move!" the captain barked, motioning them forward. One crew member stepped onto the raft first, holding out his arms to help the others. The first investor went, legs shaking as he half jumped, half fell into the raft. Edward waited for his turn, trying to judge the timing. The raft rose and fell with the waves like an elevator from hell. Miss the rhythm, and you'd be in the water instead of on a raft. When his chance came, he stepped forward, and that's when the next wave slammed into the side of the yacht. The deck tilted violently, the raft jerking away as the ropes straining against it snapped. "No!" the crewman on the raft shouted, scrambling to grab the side of the yacht, but the gap widened in seconds. The wind caught the raft's canopy like a sail, dragging it away from the stern. Edward lunged for the rope, catching the frayed end with one hand. The sudden pull almost wrenched his shoulder out of its socket, but he held on. His feet skidded on the wet wood as the raft yanked hard against him. "Pull him back," someone yelled. 2 crew members grabbed Edward around the waist, hauling him away from the edge. The rope slipped from his grip, whipping into the dark water as the raft drifted farther out. Inside it, the investors shouted something Edward couldn't hear, their voices swallowed by the storm. The captain cursed under his breath. "We'll have to launch the backup. Hurry!" The backup raft was smaller, just enough for the people still on board. They worked fast, cutting it loose from its straps, but the sea fought them with every step. Edward's hands were numb now, his fingers slow to obey as he helped push the raft into position. A wave crashed over the stern, nearly knocking him off his feet. He grabbed the railing again, chest heaving. Every instinct screamed at him to get off the yacht before the next big wave came, but the water churned below like it was waiting to swallow anyone who touched it. "Go!" the captain shouted, shoving the first crewman toward the raft. On shore, the Coast Guard boat was still pushing toward them. The radio operator's voice crackled with static. "We have visual on your position. Hold on." Maya wasn't on the shore yet. She was still at home, but the storm had knocked out the power. She sat near the window, the only light coming from the occasional lightning flash. Her mother was in the kitchen, talking to a neighbor who had come over to wait out the worst of it. Maya listened without meaning to bits and pieces of talk about the storm, about boats stuck out there. She tried not to imagine what it would be like to be trapped on one, but her mind kept forming the picture anyway. On the yacht, Edward climbed into the raft after one of the crew members. The small craft rocked violently, nearly tossing them out before they'd even cleared the deck. The captain followed last, untying the final rope and letting the current pull them away. They weren't far when Edward heard the sound, a deep, metallic groan. He turned his head just in time to see the yacht listing hard to one side. Water poured over the deck like it had been waiting for the invitation. Within seconds, the bow dipped sharply, the stern rising out of the water before crashing back down. The yacht's lights flickered once, then vanished into the dark. The raft spun in the waves, the captain shouting directions to keep them pointed into the wind. The spray was relentless, blinding in bursts. Edward tried to see the rescue boat, but the world beyond the edge of the raft was just shadows and water. Another wave smacked into them, lifting the raft high before dropping hard. Edward's stomach lurched, and for a moment, he wasn't sure which way was up. He clutched the side of the raft, knuckles white, and forced himself to breathe. "Hold tight," the captain yelled again. Maya's mother lit a candle in the living room, the warm glow small but steady against the storm's fury outside. Maya sat on the couch, knees pulled to her chest, listening to the wind batter the roof. She told herself the man from yesterday was probably safe at home in some big house far from the water. But the thought didn't make her feel better. It only made her more restless. The rescue boat finally came into view, a shadow at first, then the faint beam of its searchlight cutting through the rain. Edward felt a surge of hope, but it was short-lived. The waves between them were still huge, and the rescue boat was fighting to close the distance without capsizing itself. "Over here!" one of the crew shouted, waving both arms. The lights swept over them, holding for a moment before disappearing in the rain again. The rescue boat edged closer, but each approach was a battle. The captain of the raft shouted for everyone to keep low and hang on. Edward did, though his muscles screamed from the strain. A final wave slammed into them, and for one terrifying second, Edward thought they were flipping over. The raft tilted almost sideways, water rushing over the edge before it snapped back upright. The rescue boat was closer now, close enough that Edward could see the faces of the men on board. They threw a rope, and one of the crew in the raft caught it with both hands. They had a chance. A small one. The rope slapped wetly against the side of the raft as one of the crew clung to it with both hands. The rescue boat pitched and rolled, the waves throwing it up and down like a toy. The men aboard shouted instructions, but the wind shredded the words before they reached the raft. "Hold it tight," the captain of the raft yelled, his voice raw from the storm. Edward wrapped his own hands around the rope just below the crewman's. The wet fibers bit into his palms, but the pull of the rescue boat gave him something solid to hold on to in the chaos. Every time the wave lifted them, the rope went slack. Every time they dropped, it yanked tight again, straining their arms. Another wave crashed over both boats at once, blinding Edward in cold salt water. He blinked furiously, spitting it out, but he didn't dare let go. On shore, the rain had slowed to a steady downpour, but the wind still whipped through the streets. Maya's mother was making sure the windows stayed latched, talking with the neighbor in low, serious tones. Maya stayed near the front door, listening to the muffled roar of the ocean in the distance. She had never seen the water this angry before. Even from here, she could picture the tall waves rolling in. She imagined how small a boat would look out there now, small and fragile against all that black water. In the raft, the captain shouted, "We're going to pull alongside. Stay down until I say move." The rescue boat edged closer, the distance shrinking to just a few feet, then growing again as the swell pushed them apart. The men on a larger boat threw another line, catching the corner of the raft to keep it from drifting. "Now! Move now!" the captain barked. The first crew member scrambled over the edge, gripping the hands reaching for him from the rescue boat. The second followed, his foot slipping for a heart-stopping moment before someone hauled him aboard. Edward's turn came. He shoved the rope into the hands of the last man in the raft and crawled to the edge. The gap between the two boats seemed huge now, the rescue boat rising and falling in jerks. "Jump when I tell you," one of the rescuers shouted, his arm outstretched. Edward waited for the timing, up, and then the rescuer yelled, "Now." He lunged forward, hands grabbing at the man's arm. For a second, he thought he wasn't going to make it, his body hanging half over the water, but strong hands pulled him the rest of the way. He landed hard on the deck of the rescue boat, the impact jolting through his knees. No time to rest. Another wave slammed into them, the smaller raft jerking dangerously. The last two men scrambled aboard, the captain coming last. The moment his feet hit the deck, the crew cut the lines and pushed away. The rescue boat's engine roared, fighting the pull of the current. Edward sat against the side, chest heaving, salt water dripping from his hair into his eyes. His arms burned from holding the rope, but he was alive for now. "Everybody stay low," the rescue captain shouted. "We're not in the clear yet." The boat surged forward, climbing over the next wave before crashing down the other side. Each hit rattled through Edward's bones. The cold was sinking deeper into him now, the adrenaline beginning to fade into a dull ache in his muscles. Back at home, Maya finally sat down near the candlelight. Her mother was talking about how the roads to the shore were probably closed now. Maya didn't say anything, but in her head, she was picturing the man from yesterday. It was strange. She didn't even know his name, but she could see his face so clearly. Somewhere out there, she thought, somebody like him might be in trouble. The rescue boat pushed on, aiming for the mouth of the harbor where the waves would be smaller. But the storm wasn't done yet. A massive swell rose ahead of them, taller than anything they'd seen so far. "Hold on," the captain shouted. The wave lifted the boat high into the air before dropping it fast enough to make Edward's stomach twist. The deck shuddered under the force, but the crew kept the bow pointed into the swells, fighting to keep control. One of the investors vomited over the side, his face pale and drawn. Nobody said anything. There wasn't room for embarrassment out here, only survival. The lights of the harbor finally appeared through the rain, small and faint at first, then brighter as they drew closer. Edward's shoulders loosened slightly, though he kept one hand tight on the rail. But just as they reached the breakwater, another wave crashed over them, flooding the deck and knocking one of the crew to his knees. Edward helped pull him up, gripping his arm tightly. The captain didn't slow. "Almost there," he yelled. Inside the harbor, the water calmed, though the rain still fell hard. The rescue boat pulled up to the dock, where paramedics and Coast Guard personnel waited with blankets and stretchers. Edward stepped on his solid ground, his legs unsteady after hours of being thrown around by the sea. The paramedics moved quickly, checking each person for injuries. One wrapped a blanket around Edward's shoulders, guiding him toward a waiting ambulance. "Any head injuries? Trouble breathing?" the medic asked. "No," Edward said, his voice hoarse. "Just cold." As the ambulance doors closed, Edward looked once more toward the mouth of the harbor. The storm still raged beyond the breakwater, hiding the place where the yacht had gone under. He felt a strange pull in his chest, not relief, exactly, and not fear, but something in between. Tomorrow, he thought, he'd be in his warm penthouse again, the storm just another story to tell. But for now, all he could feel was the weight of the sea still clinging to him. And miles away, in a small house lit by candlelight, a little girl who'd once sold him lemonade was wide awake, unaware that their paths were about to cross again in a way neither could predict. Morning broke with a pale, watery light. The storm had passed, but the city still felt bruised. Branches littered the streets, gutters overflowed with debris, and the air carried the damp, heavy scent of salt and wet asphalt. Edward woke in the hospital, the scratchy blanket pulled up to his chest. The fluorescent lights above buzzed softly, and the faint beeping from the next room was the only other sound. For a moment, he just lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying the storm in his mind, the rope in his hands, the raft jerking under him, the sight of the yacht disappearing into the dark. The doctor came in, flipping through a chart. "You were lucky," she said matter-of-factly. "Some bruising, mild hypothermia, but nothing broken. You'll be discharged later today." Edward nodded, his throat still raw from the cold air and salt water. "What about the others?" "They're all stable," she replied. "You'll each need rest, but you made it out better than most do in that kind of weather." Across town, Maya stepped out onto her porch. The wooden boards creaked under her weight, still damp from the rain. The street was quiet, but the storm had left its fingerprints everywhere, shingles missing from roofs, trash cans knocked over, a stop sign leaning at an odd angle. Her mother was already outside, talking to their neighbor about the cleanup. Maya listened for a while, then wandered down the block to see the small park at the end of the street. The big oak tree there had split clean down the middle, half of it lying across the grass. She stood there for a moment, staring at the splintered trunk. Storms could change things overnight, even things that had been standing for years. Edward signed his discharge papers just after noon. The hospital gave him a fresh set of clothes, plain sweats and a t-shirt, in place of the soaked, ruined ones he'd arrived in. His driver was waiting out front, the black SUV parked at the curb. "Home?" the driver asked as Edward slid into the back seat. "Yes," Edward said, though the word felt heavier than it should have. He leaned his head back, watching the city roll by through the tinted glass. Every street seemed changed, stripped of its usual order. When they reached his penthouse building, the doorman greeted him with wide eyes. "Sir, we saw the reports. Glad you made it back." Edward gave a small nod and stepped into the elevator. Maya spent the afternoon helping her mother sweep the porch and clear the sidewalk. While they worked, a small group of people gathered on the corner, talking about the damage at the marina. "They said a yacht went down last night," one man said. "Belonged to some rich guy. Coast Guard pulled them out just in time." Maya paused mid-sweep, her grip tightening on the broom handle. She didn't say anything, but the image formed in her head, a man clinging to a rope, waves crashing around him. She remembered the calm way he had spoken to her at the lemonade stand, and for some reason, it didn't match the storm she was picturing now. By evening, Edward sat at his dining table with a cup of tea. The lights of the city glowed through the tall windows, but he wasn't looking at them. He was scrolling through his phone, reading news articles about the storm. One headline caught his eye. "Local marina suffers heavy damage. Rescue efforts praised." There was a photo of the Coast Guard boat returning to shore, the faces of the rescued barely visible in the spray. Edward zoomed in on the image. He saw himself, sitting against the side of the boat, his hands gripping the rail. It didn't look like him, not the way he was used to seeing himself. No polished suit, no careful composure. Just someone wet, cold, and clinging to something solid. That night, Maya couldn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to the drip of water from the eaves outside, her thoughts circling the same point. She told herself she was just curious about whether the man from yesterday had been in trouble. But the feeling in her chest wasn't just curiosity. It was sharper, like the moment before a race starts, a sense that something was about to happen, even if she didn't know what it was. The next morning, Edward's assistant arrived with a stack of mail and a list of meetings to reschedule. "You've had 3 reporters call already," she said. "They want a statement about the rescue." Edward waved a hand dismissively. Later, he walked to the window, watching the street below. A few people were still clearing debris, carrying trash bags to the curb. His eyes drifted over the scene without meaning to, until they stopped on a small figure near the corner, setting up a table. It was impossible, but the braids, the pink shirt, even from here he knew. Maya had decided to reopen her lemonade stand. The storm had taken the sign she'd made, so she was using a new one, the letters uneven but bright. The table wobbled slightly on the cracked sidewalk, but she pressed it steady with one hand while pouring the first cup. She didn't know that 2 blocks away, Edward had just stepped into the street. He crossed toward her without thinking, his long strides closing the distance faster than he expected. When she looked up and saw him, her eyes widened. "You," she said softly. "Me," he replied, a faint smile on his face. "I owe you another 100 for yesterday's lemonade." She shook her head. "You don't owe me anything." Edward tilted his head, studying her for a moment. "Then maybe I just came to say, thank you for making yesterday better than it could have been." They didn't speak long. He bought another cup, this time paying with the right change, and walked away. But the conversation lingered in both their minds. Neither of them could guess that within hours, the calm would break again, and this time, one of their lives would depend on the other. The sky was bright again, but the river still ran high and fast from the storm. Its surface looked restless, ripples chasing each other in sharp, quick lines. The city park near Maya's neighborhood backed right up to the riverbank, separated only by a narrow walking path and a low metal rail. Edward didn't usually walk there. His schedule rarely allowed him that kind of unplanned movement. But after visiting Maya's lemonade stand again, something made him wander toward the park. Maybe it was the quiet, or maybe he wanted space to think without the constant hum of his office. He kept his hands in his coat pockets, his eyes on the water. The current was stronger than he expected. Pieces of debris floated past, branches, leaves, even part of a broken chair. He watched them vanish around a bend, their speed unsettling. Maya was at home, rinsing out her lemonade pitcher when her neighbor Mr. Carter knocked on the door. "City's setting up a cleanup crew down by the park," he told her. "They're asking for volunteers. You want to come help?" She did. The park was where she had played since she was small. The idea of it being buried under storm trash didn't sit right. She grabbed a pair of gloves and followed him down the street. Edward noticed the workers first, a handful of people in reflective vests, pulling trash from the grass near the water. Some were hauling large plastic bags. Others were stacking branches near the path. He considered offering a donation for supplies, but before he could, a sharp sound cut through the air. It wasn't loud, but it was urgent, a metallic creak, followed by a low groan. His eyes shot toward the far end of the path. A section of the rail was bending outward, one of its bolts loose from the concrete. 2 men were trying to haul something heavy up from the water, a tangled mess of branches and plastic, and had leaned their weight against the faulty section. Maya arrived just in time to see the same thing. She dropped her gloves onto the grass and jogged closer. "That part's loose," she called out. One man stepped back, startled, but the other kept pulling. The rail shifted again, groaning under the strain. Edward didn't think. He just moved. He crossed the path quickly, grabbing the metal to brace it, but his footing slipped on the slick concrete. In an instant, his balance was gone. The world tilted. The river's edge rushed up, and then he was in the water. The shock of it was immediate, cold and fierce, wrapping around him like a fist. His breath vanished, stolen by the sudden temperature. He surfaced, coughing, the taste of river water sharp on his tongue. The current took him before he could get a grip on the edge. It yanked at his coat, pulling him sideways. His arms flailed for something to hold, but the bank was too steep, the rail too far now. "Hey, someone call 911, a voice shouted. Maya's heart slammed against her ribs. She didn't hesitate. She ran along the bank, keeping her eyes on Edward's head as it bobbed in the water. "Grab onto something," she yelled. He didn't answer. Maybe he couldn't hear her over the rush of the current. His strokes looked uneven, the weight of his clothes dragging him down. Up ahead, the bank dipped lower near a set of old stone steps that led down into the water for fishing. Maya sprinted toward them. Her sneakers slapped against the wet path, her breath burning in her chest. She reached the steps just as Edward drifted closer. Without thinking, she kicked off her shoes, waded into the freezing water, and stretched out a hand. "Take it," she shouted. Edward's hand brushed hers once, then slipped away. The current was too strong. Maya lunged forward, her feet scraping the rough stone, and grabbed his sleeve with both hands. She pulled with everything she had. He was heavier than she expected, and the water seemed determined to keep him. "Hold on," she gritted through her teeth. A man from the cleanup crew ran down the steps to help. Together, they hauled Edward toward the shallowest part, the water churning around their legs. When they finally got him onto the steps, Edward was gasping hard, his face pale. Water streamed from his coat in thick rivulets. He leaned forward, coughing, his hands gripping the stone for balance. "You're insane," he managed between breaths, looking at Maya. "Better insane than standing there," she shot back, though her voice shook from adrenaline. The cleanup crew crowded around, one man wrapping a blanket around Edward's shoulders. Someone was still on the phone with emergency services, but Edward waved it off after a moment. "I'm fine. Just cold." They sat him on the lowest dry step until his breathing steadied. Maya stayed nearby, watching him. She wasn't sure whether to be angry that he had gotten himself into danger or relieved that he was sitting there alive. When he finally met her eyes, there was something different in his expression, not the casual politeness of their lemonade stand exchanges, but a quiet, almost unsettled gratitude. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Yes, I did," she replied simply. The park slowly returned to motion. Workers went back to clearing debris, though more than a few kept glancing toward Edward. The damaged section of rail was marked with bright tape, and someone promised the city would send a crew to fix it. Edward stood at last, still wrapped in the blanket, and glanced at the river. Its surface rippled calmly now, as if nothing had happened. Maya followed his gaze. "It doesn't look like much," she said, "but it'll take you fast if you're not careful." Edward nodded. "I believe you." They walked back toward the street together. Neither spoke much, but each step felt strangely heavier, as though the quiet carried its own weight. In Edward's mind, he kept replaying the moment her hand closed around his sleeve, the stubborn grip, the pull against the current. Maya, for her part, was trying not to picture what might have happened if she had been even a few seconds slower. The next morning, the sky was a washed-out blue, the kind that made the streets look softer, quieter. Maya woke up late for Saturday, the sun already reaching through her curtains. Her body still felt heavy from yesterday, the sprinting, the freezing water, the shock of it all. She went into the kitchen, and her mother was at the table, reading the local paper. A steaming mug of coffee sat beside her. "You made the paper," her mother said without looking up. "What?" Maya blinked. Her mother turned the paper around. On the front page of the community section was a blurry photo of Maya, barefoot on the park steps, pulling Edward from the water. The caption read, "Local girl helps rescue prominent businessman from river accident." Maya's stomach twisted. She hadn't thought about other people seeing it. "That's weird." "It's good," her mother replied. "Shows people you're not just sitting around." She smiled, but there was pride in her eyes. Across town, Edward sat in his apartment, reading the same article. He had never liked seeing his own name in the news, too much attention, too many calls afterward from people pretending to be old friends. But this was different. The words rescued and teen in the same sentence hit harder than he expected. He set the paper aside and leaned back, staring at the ceiling for a moment. His phone rang. "Edward, I saw the news," said a familiar voice, Mark, his longtime attorney. "You okay?" "I'm fine. You could have been gone, man." "You should think about, I'm fine, Mark," Edward cut in. "I'm just fine." But as he hung up, he wasn't sure he believed it. By late afternoon, Maya decided to go outside, partly to avoid more questions from neighbors who had already begun knocking on the door. She took the long way around toward the corner store, hoping the quiet streets would keep her invisible. Halfway there, a black SUV slowed beside her. She froze, ready to bolt, until the window rolled down and Edward leaned out. "Need a ride?" he asked. "No," she said automatically. "I'm not kidnapping you," he replied, half smiling. "Just figured you might want to talk." She hesitated, then opened the passenger door and slid in. The SUV smelled faintly of leather and something expensive she couldn't name. Edward pulled back into the street. "So, how's your Saturday been?" "Normal," she said. "Yours?" "Too many calls," he replied. Most of them pretending to be concerned, but really just wanting a quote or an interview. "That's what happens when you're whatever you are," she said. He glanced at her. "Whatever I am." "You know," she said, "rich, important. One of those people who always has their face somewhere." He laughed softly. "Is that all I am?" They drove toward the edge of town, where the river curved back near a quiet stretch of woods. The road here was narrow, lined with tall grass. Edward parked near an overlook. From here, you could see the water moving slower, the surface calmer than yesterday's roaring current. "I wanted to see it in daylight," he said, stepping out. Maya followed, keeping a few steps behind. Standing at the railing, Edward gripped it with both hands. Yesterday could have gone very differently. "Yeah," Maya said quietly. He looked over at her. "Why did you do it? You could have just called for help and waited." "I didn't think," she replied. "I just moved." "That's what you do when someone's drowning." He nodded slowly. "You're braver than most people I know." She shrugged, not used to compliments from someone like him. Or maybe just faster. A sudden shout broke the quiet, not near but far down the bank. Both of them turned. A boy, maybe 10, was standing too close to the edge, pointing at something in the water. His dog barked beside him. Maya squinted. A long, dark shape floated just under the surface, caught in a slow spin. "Stay here," Edward said, already moving. But Maya didn't stay. She followed him down the sloping path toward the boy. When they reached him, they realized the dark shape wasn't an animal or debris. It was a kayak, upside down. "Someone's under there," the boy cried. The river was calmer here, but the kayak was wedged between two submerged branches, its bright orange bottom visible above the waterline. Edward stripped off his jacket without a word and waded in. Maya's chest tightened. She wanted to stop him, but the boy's voice made it impossible to think of anything but speed. Edward reached the kayak and tried to flip it. It resisted, heavy and awkward. He braced one foot on a branch and shoved harder. The kayak rolled, and a man's face broke the surface, sputtering. The man clung to the side, coughing hard. "Rope," he gasped. Maya scanned the bank, spotted a coil of rope near the boy's dog leash, and tossed it toward Edward. Edward wrapped it around the man's chest and pulled with steady force. Maya grabbed the rope too, digging her heels into the mud. Together, they hauled the man toward the shore. By the time they got him onto the grass, the man was shivering but alive. He muttered thanks, his voice shaky. The boy hugged his dog, eyes wide. "I thought he was going to die," he said. Maya's hands were trembling, but not from cold. She glanced at Edward, wood again, hair dripping, breathing hard. He met her eyes and gave a small, tired smile. "Guess it's my turn," he said. They walked back to the SUV in silence, the sound of the river fading behind them. When they reached the overlook again, Edward leaned against the hood. "You know," he said, "it's strange. I've been around a lot of people in my life. Powerful people, but the only ones who've actually been there when it mattered aren't those people at all." Maya didn't answer, but she understood exactly what he meant. That night, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the kayak, the boy's voice, the way Edward had moved without hesitation. And somewhere in those thoughts was the uncomfortable realization that their lives kept crossing in ways that felt deliberate, even though she didn't believe in that kind of thing. The Sunday morning sun spilled gold across the sidewalks. The air felt warmer than the day before, almost like the town was trying to shake off the tension of the last 48 hours. Maya stood behind her lemonade stand again, the folding table slightly crooked on the uneven concrete. She had not planned to set it up this morning, but something inside her told her she needed to be there. Her mother had shaken her head when she left. "You've been running into enough excitement. Try to keep today quiet." Maya had nodded, but quiet wasn't something she could promise lately. The street was still slow when she saw the familiar black SUV turning the corner. It stopped at the curb, and Edward stepped out, sunglasses pushing his hair back. He looked more rested today, though his movements were still deliberate, like someone thinking about each step before taking it. "Back in business?" he asked, walking up to the table. "Somebody has to keep the town hydrated," she replied. Edward smiled, reached into his wallet, and handed her a crisp 20. "1 cup." She poured it, cold and bright yellow, handing it to him. He took a sip and set the cup down. "I never said thank you properly," he began. "You already did," she said. "No," he shook his head. "Not for just yesterday. For both days." Maya shrugged. "I didn't plan either. Things just happened." "That's the thing," he said, leaning on the table. "You don't plan heroism. You just are one, or you're not." Before she could answer, a commotion broke out down the block, yelling, hurried footsteps. Both of them turned. A man in a blue jacket was running toward the pier at the far end of the street, shouting something they couldn't catch. People followed him at a distance, unsure whether to get closer. Maya caught a few words in the rush. "Boat stuck. Current. Help." Her stomach clenched. She glanced at Edward. "Don't tell me," he started. But she was already moving, grabbing her sneakers as she ran. The pier jutted into the river, the same river where everything had started. This section was wider, and today the current was pulling faster, the surface choppy with wind. A small fishing boat had drifted sideways, its motor clearly dead. 2 people were on board, an older man at the wheel, a younger one holding a rope that dangled uselessly into the water. "They can't get back in," someone shouted from the dock. Edward arrived beside her, scanning the scene. "There's a rescue line on the dock," he pointed, "but it's too short to reach them from here." Maya's eyes moved to a lower service platform a few yards down, barely above the waterline. "What if I get closer?" Edward didn't like the look in her eye. "Maya, I'm not diving in," she cut him off, just getting the rope to them. She sprinted to the platform, the wood slick under her shoes. Grabbing the coiled rescue rope, she tested its weight and then shouted to the boat. "Catch this." The younger man nodded, bracing himself. She threw, the rope arcing in the air before landing just shy of the bow. Edward was already moving down beside her. "Again," he said, gathering the rope and handing it back. She threw harder this time, the cord smacking against the boat's side. The younger man grabbed it instantly, wrapping it around a cleat. "Pull," he shouted. Maya and Edward leaned back, heels digging into the wood. At first, nothing happened, The boat barely moved against the current. But slowly, inch by inch, they drew it toward the dock. Sweat prickled at Maya's neck despite the cool air. Her arms burned, but she kept pulling. Edward matched her, his jaw set. Finally, with a loud scrape, the boat bumped against the dock's edge. Hands reached down to secure it, and the two men climbed up, soaked but breathing hard. The older man gripped Maya's shoulder. "We'd have been gone if you two hadn't been here." She didn't know what to say, so she just nodded. Edward clapped the man on the back, then looked down at Maya. "That's 3, he said quietly. "3 what?" she asked. "3 times in 2 days where something could have gone very wrong, and you were there." She frowned. "You were there too." They walked back toward the lemonade stand in a slower silence, the adrenaline wearing off. When they reached it, the cup of lemonade Edward had left earlier was still sweating in the sun. He picked it up, drank the rest, and set it down. "I think," he said slowly, "you've changed the way I see things." "Because I pulled you out of the water?" "No," he shook his head. "Because I realized all the money, all the walls I built around myself. None of it mattered when I was underwater. What mattered was someone willing to act." Maya didn't answer, but a small smile tugged at her mouth. A passing couple stopped to buy lemonade. Edward stepped back, letting her handle the sale. When they walked off, he said, "I want to help you." "I'm fine," she replied. "I don't mean charity. I mean opportunity. You ever think about running something bigger than this stand?" She blinked. "Like what?" He shrugged. "A business. A project. Something that lets people see what I've seen the last 2 days." For a moment, the street noise seemed distant. She thought of the paper's photo, of the kayak, of the fishing boat. "Maybe," she said. Edward nodded. "We'll talk. But for now," he pulled another 20 from his wallet, sliding it onto the table. "That's for the best cup of lemonade I've ever had." This time she laughed. Later, as the sun lowered and the shadows stretched long over the river, Maya packed up her stand. Edward was gone, but his words stayed with her, circling in her mind. She realized something else. If he hadn't stopped for lemonade that first day, if she hadn't been standing there at that exact moment, none of what followed would have happened. And maybe that was the strangest part of all. Not fate, not magic, just the simple truth that sometimes showing up was everything. That night, the river was quiet. But somewhere in town, a white billionaire and a black little girl were thinking about the same thing. How a paper cup of lemonade had started something neither of them could have planned, but both would remember for the rest of their lives. If you like this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Also, and other to strengthen our community. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from and what time you are currently watching this video.